Jake first noticed something was off when Melissa suddenly became obsessed with mountain climbing. It wasn't a gradual interest, the kind that grows naturally over time. No, this was an all-consuming passion that appeared out of nowhere, like a spark catching dry tinder. One day she was content with their evening jogs around the neighborhood, and the next she was rattling off climbing techniques, avalanche safety protocols, and the best spots for beginner mountaineers. At first he found it admirable, a new hobby, something to challenge her, to push her limits. What's not to support? He listened as she talked about gear, watched as she spent hours browsing online stores for the best harnesses, ropes, and carabiners. She even joined an outdoor fitness group, one that specialized in climbing preparation. "If I'm going to do this," she had said, her brown eyes sparkling with determination, "I need to do it right." Jake had always loved that about her, her intensity, her ability to throw herself fully into something. But as the weeks went on, something didn't sit right. She trained constantly, or so she claimed. 3, sometimes 4 times a week she'd tell him she was heading to the climbing gym or on a conditioning run with her new group. Yet, when she got home, she never looked tired. No sore muscles, no fresh calluses from gripping rough rock walls or pull-up bars. Even stranger, he never saw her packing or unpacking gear. "How was training?" he asked one evening, watching her kick off her sneakers with ease. "Brutal," she groaned, stretching her arms over her head. "We worked grip strength today. My hands are killing me." Jake glanced at them. Smooth, unblemished, no redness, no strain. He felt a familiar unease creep up his spine but pushed it aside. Maybe she was just naturally good at it. Maybe she wasn't climbing yet, just doing strength exercises. Still, doubt lingered. One night, curiosity got the best of him. Melissa had left for a long session at the climbing gym, so he pulled out his phone and opened the location tracker they had both agreed to enable years ago. It wasn't something he normally checked, but something in his gut told him to look. The pin didn't show her at the gym. Instead, it hovered over a parking lot across town, a place Jake didn't recognize. Frowning, he grabbed his keys and drove. When he got there, he parked a short distance away and scanned the area. The lot was dimly lit, mostly empty, except for a single car parked under a flickering street lamp. And then he saw her. Melissa stood beside the car, laughing, her hand resting casually on the open window. The man inside, Ryan, Jake realized with a sickening jolt, smiled up at her. Then, as if in slow motion, she slid into the passenger seat, her body language relaxed, familiar. Jake clenched the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. She had built an alibi as strong as a mountain, but now her lies were crumbling. Jake sat frozen in his car, his fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his nails pressed into his palms. His heart hammered in his chest as he watched Melissa laugh, her head tilting back in that easy, natural way she did when she was completely at ease. The way she looked at Ryan, with warmth and familiarity, sent a cold rush through Jake's veins. For weeks she had fed him stories about grueling workouts, difficult climbs, and how she was pushing her body to the limit. But there she was, effortlessly slipping into Ryan's car, looking anything but exhausted. She wasn't limping from a long training session. There were no chalk stains on her clothes, no sweat clinging to her skin. Just a carefree woman, betraying everything she had spent weeks making Jake believe. He inhaled sharply through his nose, trying to steady his breathing. His first instinct was to storm over, rip open the car door, and demand answers. But he stopped himself. Confronting her here in the middle of a parking lot wouldn't get him the truth. It would only get him lies, excuses, half-baked stories she'd spin on the spot. No, he needed to be smart. He needed to see how far this went. Jake turned off his headlights and slouched lower in his seat as Ryan's car pulled out of the lot. The engine purred smoothly as it merged onto the main road, and Jake followed from a safe distance, careful not to get too close. His mind raced as he trailed them through town, past quiet neighborhoods and dimly lit streets. Where were they going? A restaurant? A bar? A hotel? His grip on the wheel tightened at the last thought. After about 20 minutes, Ryan's car turned onto a secluded road that led into a wooded area. There were no stores or businesses nearby, just trees and the occasional dimly lit house tucked far back from the road. Jake frowned, suspicion flaring in his chest. This wasn't a casual meet-up spot. This was private, hidden, a place where no one would see them. Ryan finally pulled into a gravel clearing, a spot just out of sight from the main road. The headlights cut off and the car sat still. Jake parked at a distance, his own lights off, barely breathing as he watched. After a moment, the passenger door opened. Melissa stepped out and Ryan followed. Jake watched as they stood close, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that spoke of familiarity, of comfort. Then Ryan reached up, tucking a strand of Melissa's hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled. Jake felt something inside him crack. He had held on to hope, however foolish, that maybe, just maybe, there was an explanation for all of this. That somehow what he was seeing was a misunderstanding. But that simple touch, that small, intimate gesture, shattered any illusions he had left. His stomach churned as he thought back over the last few months. The moments when Melissa had come home late, claiming she had lost track of time at the gym. The way she had showered the second she walked in the door, as if washing away any lingering scent of where she had truly been. The nights when she had seemed distant, distracted, her mind somewhere else. It all made sense now. Jake exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay in control. Anger pulsed through his veins, hot and unrelenting, but he refused to let it consume him. He needed to think. If he stormed over there now, what would it accomplish? She'd lie. She'd gaslight him. She'd twist it around until he was the bad guy for spying on her. No, he wasn't going to let her manipulate him. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. He snapped a few photos, capturing the way Melissa looked at Ryan, the way she leaned into him. He recorded a short video, ensuring he had undeniable proof of her betrayal. Then he put the phone down and simply watched. He wanted to see how far this would go. He needed to know. Minutes stretched on, and the two of them stood there, talking, laughing, completely unaware of the devastation they were leaving in their wake. Finally, Ryan reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers as he pulled her toward the car. Jake clenched his jaw as he saw Melissa hesitate for a fraction of a second, then give in, letting him guide her inside. Jake had seen enough. With slow, deliberate movements, he started his engine and pulled away, his mind already formulating his next move. This wasn't just about a cheating wife. This was about respect, dignity, truth. Melissa thought she had the perfect cover. She thought her alibi was unshakable. But now Jake had the evidence to bring it all crashing down. Jake barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Melissa laughing with Ryan, the way she let him tuck her hair behind her ear, replayed in his mind like a cruel, looping nightmare. He had thought about confronting her as soon as she walked through the door, demanding an explanation the second she stepped into their home. But as the hours dragged on and he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, he knew that wouldn't be enough. He didn't want explanations, he wanted the truth, and the only way to get it was to catch her when she couldn't twist her way out of it. The next evening, when Melissa left for yet another training session, Jake didn't hesitate. He waited for her location to update, confirming she was once again nowhere near the climbing gym, and then he grabbed his keys and left. This time, he wasn't just going to watch. He kept a safe distance as he followed her to the same secluded spot in the woods where she had met Ryan the night before. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind eerily calm. The fury from last night had settled into something colder, sharper, determination. This wasn't about blind rage. This was about exposing her for exactly what she was. By the time Jake arrived, Ryan's car was already there, parked under the canopy of trees, hidden from casual passers-by. He pulled over just far enough away to avoid being noticed and watched as Melissa stepped out of the vehicle, the soft glow of the moon illuminating her face. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders and got out of his car. Melissa and Ryan stood near the hood of the car, talking in hushed voices, oblivious to his presence. She was smiling, completely at ease, her body language open and familiar. Jake's stomach twisted, but he pushed the feeling down. He was past the point of feeling hurt. Now he wanted her to see that she had lost control of the story she had so carefully crafted. As he approached, the gravel crunched beneath his feet, drawing their attention. Melissa turned first, and the second her eyes met his, all the color drained from her face. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came out. Ryan, on the other hand, reacted much slower. He looked confused at first, then wary, his gaze darting between Melissa and Jake as realization dawned. Jake stopped a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "So," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this is what training looks like?" Melissa inhaled sharply, her fingers twitching at her sides. "Jake, save it," he cut her off. "I don't need to hear whatever excuse you were about to come up with." He tilted his head slightly, observing her. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious. What was the plan? Were you going to tell me you fell off a climbing wall, twist your ankle to sell the lie? Or was tonight's story something more creative?" Melissa swallowed, her eyes darting toward Ryan for a fraction of a second before returning to Jake. That tiny glance, that fleeting moment of seeking reassurance, told Jake everything he needed to know. Ryan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Look, man." Jake turned his gaze on him, leveling him with a stare so cold it made Ryan stop mid-sentence. "Don't," Jake warned, his voice low. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to stand there and act like you're just some innocent bystander in all this." Ryan clenched his jaw but remained silent. Melissa exhaled shakily. "Jake, I never meant for..." "For what?" Jake challenged. "For me to find out?" He shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "You know, the worst part isn't even the cheating. It's the fact that you looked me in the eyes every single day and lied to my face." "Again and again," Melissa flinched. "I was going to tell you," Jake laughed dryly. "When? After your next expedition? After you and Ryan found a cozy little cabin to disappear into for the weekend?" His voice hardened. "Or were you planning to drag this out until I caught you with no way to deny it?" Melissa pressed her lips together, blinking rapidly as if she could will herself to cry to make him feel sorry for her, but Jake wasn't going to fall for it. Not this time. He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "I have photos," he continued, his tone devoid of emotion, "videos, everything I need to make sure our friends, your little outdoor adventure group, know exactly what kind of person you are." Melissa's breath hitched. "Jake, please." Don't what?" "Tell the truth." He raised an eyebrow. "Funny how that suddenly matters to you now." He turned his gaze to Ryan. "And you? What do you think happens when people find out? You've built your entire reputation around being a leader in the climbing community. How do you think it'll look when people realize you're the guy sneaking around with another man's wife behind his back?" Ryan's expression darkened, but he didn't speak. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. Jake let out a breath, taking one last look at the woman he had once trusted with everything. "I hope it was worth it, Melissa," he said, his voice quiet. "Because this is what the end looks like?" Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing there, her lies finally exposed for what they were. Jake didn't look back as he walked away from the confrontation, but he could hear Melissa calling after him, her voice tight with desperation. "Jake, please, wait, just talk to me." Talk? After all the lies, after the betrayal, after watching her melt into Ryan's arms while feeding him stories about training and climbing? No, she didn't deserve his words. She didn't deserve anything from him anymore. He reached his car, got in and slammed the door shut. His fingers gripped the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. His breath came fast, uneven, but he forced himself to slow it down. This wasn't just about Melissa and Ryan anymore. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his self-respect. It was about making sure that the people who mattered knew exactly what had happened, that Melissa's lies didn't just quietly fade away. By the time he pulled into their driveway, his mind was already racing with the next steps. Melissa would come home soon, probably ready to spin another version of events, pleading with him to understand, to work through it. But Jake had no interest in working through anything. He had spent years being the supportive husband, the understanding partner, the man who stood by her through every wild passion she picked up and dropped. This wasn't one of those things, this was calculated. He walked straight into their shared home, the space that suddenly felt foreign to him. The walls that had once held their laughter, their shared dreams, now felt suffocating. Every framed photo of them together felt like a joke, a cruel reminder of the life he thought he had. He grabbed his laptop and began uploading the evidence he had gathered. The photos, the videos, the timestamps of her so-called training sessions that had nothing to do with climbing walls and everything to do with sneaking around. He composed a message to their mutual friends, the ones Melissa had woven into her fabricated world of adventure. Just a heads up to everyone who's been asking about Melissa's climbing journey. Turns out she wasn't training to conquer mountains, she was training to lie better. If you want to see what she was actually doing during all those sessions, feel free to check the attached photos. Ryan, the so-called climbing mentor, was happy to provide some hands-on guidance, just not the kind she pretended it was. Jake sat back rereading the message. His hands shook, not from hesitation but from the adrenaline still coursing through him. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't interested in making a scene. He just wanted the truth out in the open, where it couldn't be manipulated or rewritten by Melissa's excuses. He hit send. Almost immediately, his phone began vibrating. Texts poured in. Friends, people from Melissa's climbing group, mutual acquaintances. Some messages were filled with shock, others with disbelief. A few offered sympathy, but most were just stunned reactions. And then, an unexpected call. Ryan. Jake stared at the screen, the name flashing like an insult. He let it ring until it stopped, then set the phone down. What could Ryan possibly say? That it wasn't what it looked like. That he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. That Melissa had told him she was in a failing marriage. That she was planning to leave anyway. None of it mattered. Instead, Jake turned his focus to something more concrete, moving forward. The divorce papers would come next, and he wanted them drawn up as soon as possible. He wasn't going to be one of those men who begged or fought to salvage something that had already been destroyed. Melissa had made her choice. She had burned the bridge between them, and he wasn't interested in rebuilding it. When Melissa finally came home later that night, her face was a mess of emotions. Fear, regret, desperation. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, her hands twisting together as if she were rehearsing a plea. "Jake," she started, her voice soft, careful. "Can we just talk?" He didn't even look up from his laptop. "There's nothing left to say." Her breath hitched. "Please, I made a mistake, but we can get past this." Jake finally met her gaze, and the sheer emptiness in his expression seemed to knock the breath out of her. "A mistake," he repeated flatly. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is missing a dinner reservation." "You didn't make a mistake, Melissa. You made a choice." Repeatedly, tears welled up in her eyes. "I was going to tell you. Jake raised a hand, silencing her. "Don't," he said, his voice cold. "Don't try to rewrite this. Don't try to make it sound like you were searching for the right moment to come clean. You weren't. You were hoping I'd never find out." She inhaled sharply, her shoulders shaking. "I don't want to lose you." Jake let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for months. He felt tired, but not in the way heartbreak usually made people feel. It wasn't sadness that drained him. It was clarity. He had already lost her. She just hadn't realized it yet. "I already filed for divorce," he said, standing up. "You'll be getting the paperwork soon." Melissa's face crumpled. "Jake, no. Please. I love you." He shook his head, stepping past her. "No, you don't," he said simply. "You just don't want to deal with the consequences of what you did." He didn't stay to hear her response. Instead, he grabbed his car keys and walked out, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her own choices. By the time he reached the end of the street, his phone buzzed with another message, this time from one of their mutual friends. "She's in total meltdown mode. Ryan's panicking too. Guess neither of them expected to actually face the fallout." Jake let out a breath and typed a simple response, "Not my problem anymore." And with that, he drove away, not just from their house, but from the entire life he had built with Melissa, the one she had so carelessly shattered. The silence in the house was deafening. It was strange, Jake thought, how quickly a place could feel unfamiliar, even when nothing had physically changed. The furniture was still the same. The walls still held the same photos of vacations, birthdays, and anniversaries that now felt like relics of a life that had belonged to someone else. But the air had shifted. Melissa was gone. The divorce proceedings had moved quickly, much faster than Jake had expected. He had made it clear from the start he wasn't interested in negotiations, drawn-out conversations, or second chances. The moment she betrayed him, she lost the privilege of being in his life. The papers were signed, assets divided, and just like that, the woman he had once planned to grow old with was nothing more than a name on legal documents. He had expected the relief to come immediately. He thought that once her name was no longer tied to his, once she had packed her belongings and walked out of their home for the last time, he would feel lighter. But the truth was, it took time. The weight of her betrayal wasn't something he could shed overnight. For weeks, he caught himself waiting for things to return to normal, for the daily rhythms of life to feel right again. He would wake up expecting to hear the sound of Melissa moving around the kitchen, humming absent-mindedly as she made her morning coffee. He would catch himself glancing at his phone, half expecting one of her texts about groceries or dinner plans. But there was nothing, just the reality of a new life he had to rebuild from the ground up. Melissa, on the other hand, was not handling things well. Word had spread quickly through their social circles thanks to Jake's carefully curated exposure of her lies. Their mutual friends, once part of her elaborate facade of adventure and self-improvement, wanted nothing to do with her. The outdoor climbing community, a place where she had hoped to cement herself as an enthusiast, now saw her as nothing more than a fraud. Ryan, realizing that his reputation was on the line, distanced himself from her almost immediately. Jake heard through the grapevine that Melissa had tried to salvage her relationships, reaching out to old friends, attempting to rewrite the story, painting herself as the victim of a misunderstanding. But there was no spinning this. The truth was too clear, too undeniable. She had spent months crafting an illusion, and when it shattered, it left her with nothing. One night, weeks after the finalization of their divorce, Jake received an unexpected message from her. "Melissa, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I just need you to know that I'm sorry." He stared at the screen for a long time, debating whether or not to respond. Did she mean it? Was it genuine regret? Or was this another attempt to ease her own guilt, to find some form of absolution so she could sleep at night? In the end, it didn't matter. Jake deleted the message without replying. Moving forward wasn't just about cutting her out of his life. It was about refusing to let her take up any more space in his mind. She had already stolen enough of his time, his trust, his love. She didn't get to take his peace, too. As the months passed, the ache in his chest dulled. He started going out more, reconnecting with friends, taking up hobbies that had nothing to do with Melissa or the life they had built together. He booked a solo trip to the mountains. Not to chase after some illusion of adventure, but to prove to himself that he was more than what she had reduced him to. Standing at the base of a towering peak, feeling the crisp mountain air on his face, Jake realized something. Melissa had spent months pretending to train for a climb she never intended to make, but he was actually doing it, and for the first time in a long time he felt truly free.